All right. It's very nice to see you all. I'm happy to report that my air conditioning is repaired, so I feel like more like a human. Um, so, this week is going to be particularly busy. If you have questions about the assignment, the analysis assignment, or anything else, don't hesitate to ask. Now, if I'm going to try to keep with the schedule, which means that we've got to get through 3 chapters this week. So I'm definitely sure I could get through 1.5 chapters today and 1.5 chapters on Thursday. So I think I will break it up that way, but I hope to seed within the lecture our discussion questions. Let me turn the chime off. All right. Okay. I will, one other thing, I will have my normal student hours on Thursday afternoon. These are just times that I will have a Zoom meeting open if you want to drop in and ask me questions more directly than through email. This is just something that we have available to you coming up. All right.
Professor, just one thing before you start.
Yeah, Yara.
You haven't posted anything about the movie that we're going to be writing about. Is there any specific ones? I know that you mentioned in the past we can pick any movie that we want as far as about history. But I just want to, I would really appreciate it if you have any recommendation that we can watch.
You've got if you look on the module in Canvas for that analysis assignment, it has a list of movies.
Oh, I see that. I'm so sorry I missed it.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's fine. Thank you for letting me point that out. As far as what movie to watch, I think I'm leaving it up to your personal taste. If there's a particular era you're interested in, or if there is a film that you've been wanting to see on the list, that maybe this is a good time to see it, or there might be something else that catches your eye. I will admit I have not seen all of the films on the list. I've seen probably, I would guess 75 to 80% of them. So yeah, I'm trying to watch too many films now too. All right. So the aftermath of the French Revolution, and of course Napoleon and his rampage throughout Europe, is going to encourage many people to try to prevent this from happening again. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, because the effort to keep it from happening again is going to foster even more rebellions, even more revolutions. So what we'll be talking about, there'll be a lot of really good ideas and a lot of excitement, and a lot of it will come to absolute failure. So the Congress of Vienna is the aspect that I'll be talking about first, and that is going to be a movement by the great powers of Europe. By great powers, we generally mean kingdoms. There's not going to be a lot of representative government. In the Congress of Vienna, even though it sounds, we're used to a Congress being something that we elect people to, this is not what we're talking about at all. It is going to be kings and representative of kings and emperors meeting to figure things out. So it's not going to look much at all like we're used to thinking of a Congress. So the dominant forces that are going to be meeting will, of course, be Tsar Alexander I of Russia. The Russians had expended a huge amount of manpower in getting rid of Napoleon. Of course, remember, Napoleon had marched on Russia, and got as far as Moscow before he turned around and left in a horribly disastrous retreat. And Alexander's troops are going to be chasing Napoleon's troops all the way to Paris. And this, having the officer corps of the Russian military going through the rest of Europe is going to seed some ideas in their head as far as, oh, Europe is very different than how things are being run in Russia. And this is going to foment some problems in a brief order for Russia. However, Alexander I is above the fray. He considers himself the liberator of Europe. He's the one that took care of Napoleon. And he is going to try to impose his very powerful will on this Congress of Vienna. Representing France at this Congress of Vienna is a prince by the name of Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. Yes, Napoleon was on the losing side, which means France was on the losing side. But once they got rid of Napoleon, a monarchy took place in France, and they were allowed to come back into this Congress of Vienna. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand is an imposing figure throughout European history. He was a bishop before the revolution. He was a revolutionary during the revolution. He was in the midst of everything happening in France at the time. He served Napoleon as a foreign minister, and now here he is after Napoleon's defeat, representing France at the Congress of Vienna. Somebody who is going to make it through all of those different changes and come out still fairly on top is an imposing individual. He was a man who made his living and stayed alive because of his extreme capabilities in terms of diplomacy and negotiating and using soft power to get where he needed to go. So he was an interesting choice to represent France for the Congress of Vienna. And in Austria, the Emperor of Austria will not be there. The Emperor will be represented by Clemens von Metternich, who was an important minister for the emperor. He was of minor nobility. He also was a very powerful administrator. The Austrian Empire, or otherwise known as the Habsburg Empire, was a very disparate group of ethnicities, little principalities, and it's all under one umbrella. And so the choice of Metternich was someone who was extremely conservative and extremely forceful in and strong in his method of administering the rule of law in Austria. However, he is going to come to the Congress of Vienna as someone who is going to be writing up the important papers and figuring out what is going to go on. There were no rules existing for the Congress of Vienna. This was a brand new sort of idea. And they're going to come up with some important ideological issues and also some important international legal issues. Was it an early, like a United Nations? After a fashion. We've got a long way to go before we get to the United Nations. This Congress was there to try to restore order and make sure that the right people were in charge. These people, of course, considered Napoleon to be one of the wrong people to be in charge. And once he's gone, one of the goals of this Congress is to be the people who decide who are the legitimate political authorities for all of Europe. So they're not basically going to be happy with just pronouncing that they are in charge, but they want to be able to tell other kingdoms who should be their king. They want to halt French expansion because Napoleon had tried to take over lots of areas, but by halting French expansion or taking back land that France had taken throughout Europe, that means that other empires like the Austrian Empire and the Prussian Empire and maybe even the Russian Empire will be looking to get more land for themselves. So the prevention of French expansion is really cutting up those places that France had claimed and divvying them up between the people who attended the Congress of Vienna. They wanted to create something of a balance of power. They didn't want to have one kingdom or empire above everybody else. So they wanted the powers to balance out. They also were trying to negotiate land difficulties in the German-speaking areas and Poland. Poland is going to try to attempt some rebellions. They're not going to be very successful about it this time. And the Congress of Vienna is going to help the Austrian Empire take over quite a bit of Poland, but also the Russian Empire to take over quite a bit of Poland as well. Now, there is an interesting aspect to this Congress of Vienna that is going to be problematic as time goes on, and that is Great Britain. Remember, Great Britain is right in the midst of her industrial revolution, and under Napoleon's rule over Europe was the continental system, which meant that Great Britain could not sell anything to any of the countries France had any control over on the continent. And this hurt Great Britain's business interests. And the British wanted compensation for their losing money in their business interests, for spending a huge amount of money to defeat Napoleon, and also to keep the shipping lanes open. So the British were not looking for land so much as actual physical money from France, because France had been beaten. And this is an interesting tradition that's going to be carried forward, that the losing of a war means that you have to pay some sort of compensation to the winner, whether it's land or gold bullion. This is going to be very problematic in the 20th century. But up at this moment in time, the British are just asking for their little bit of money. So securing the peace and creating a permanent stability in Europe. You can read that as not necessarily ending wars. They're not talking about not going to war anywhere, but making sure there are no more revolutions. That idea of stability is the stability that comes with a absolute monarch. So this alliance, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and France will be getting together to agree to settle problems verbally or through soft power, rather than going to war over every little detail. Tsar Alexander I, however, is going to try to turn this alliance into a more religious sort of arrangement, because he sees the Christian aspect of all of these different countries. Against who? The Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim at the time. And so this Holy Alliance that Alexander I was pushing for was a pro-Christianity sort of movement. In other words, the idea of Europe only for Christians, which meant a rise in anti-Semitism and very strong anti-Islam sentiments. And one other thing, I had mentioned this before, that this alliance wanted to be the ones that decided which ruler was legitimate. They're going to move away from the concept of divine right of kings. Kings are in place because God put them there, and put that legitimacy into their own hands, that instead of just taking someone's say-so, they're going to base the legitimacy of each ruler on international treaties. A big difference from how it had happened before. So here is, I had just mentioned this, I need to edit that slide. Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia. Alexander is an interesting character because he was fairly young, middle-aged by the time the Congress of Vienna is happening, and he had at times been enamored of Napoleon and his military victories, and at other times very upset at Napoleon. But once Napoleon is gone, Alexander I is reported to have become very spiritualistic. Not so much having an epiphany, because he was always Russian Orthodox, but he wanted to base decisions more on a religious basis or a spiritual basis rather than a reason or rationed basis.
Professor, I have a question.
Sir, yes.
So he was against Nepal.
He was against which?
Nepal country. Or Nepalese.
Nepal?
Huh?
I don't know. I do not know what Alexander the First's
He's a Russian.
Eastern. Sure.
He against European or he against Nepal?
Alexander the First had started out to be very much a Westernizer, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, looking to Europe. But later on in his rule, he's going to be looking more and more to the Far East, to the less developed areas. Yeah, it's going to take quite some time before the Russians and the Chinese actually settle on a border between the two.
So he wanted to dominate Europe, and he extend and through Asian. That's European. That's what you mean.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So he want to dominate all Europe countries.
No, he was very much interested in forming an alliance with the other kings and emperors. He was very anti-republican in that he was not interested in commoners who rule or republican-style governments. He was very conservative in that he wanted to keep the rule going, his rule going and the rule of the other monarchs in Europe.
Professor.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the discussion questions that I had for this chapter was on the Congress of Vienna. I had a video there for you to watch. So there was the group that was doing that. It was the internal combustion group. They as you're thinking about your discussion question for that, I asked, do you think the Congress of Vienna was a very progressive idea in that these countries were getting together to decide on solving their differences with words and international treaties rather than through strict warfare? Or do you think it was regressive in that it boosted the power of the absolute monarchs? So going back to a form of government that had been in the main before the French Revolution. So just going to throw that open to people as a discussion question.
I would think it happened after the revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh yeah, it happened after the revolution, but was this Congress of Vienna a progressive sort of idea with monarchies settling their differences with words, not war? Or was it regressive because it was putting down revolutions and ensuring the strength of monarchs?
I think it was regressive because when I watched The Miserables earlier today, and when I did research on the background, like the event that Victor Hugo was trying to depict, I think that the French, like after Napoleon, they thought that they would find a ruler who would like more liberal, but in the end, they found like another tyrant that the monarch that want to like the whole, like the total control of everything. So I think there was like a regressive movement. It's not progressive.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, An. Is there anyone else? Okay. There were plenty of people who were not monarchs or even in line for the monarchy who opposed the Congress of Vienna. One of the most important of these groups was a group known as the Carbonari. It was a secret organization that had gotten together to oppose the Congress of Vienna, oppose conservatism. They were very much in favor of a republic, in that they wanted a end of monarchy and a spread of constitutions. They were very powerful, or at least their movement was very popular and powerful in Southern Europe and in France in the 1820s. Because it was a secret organization, they couldn't all meet, so it was very difficult for them to agree on exactly where they wanted to go, as far as what their aims were and their goals. Some are going to call for constitutions and strict republican government. Others are going to be very fond of Napoleon, because Napoleon Bonaparte, even though he was an emperor, was trying to spread certain very liberal republican ideals. I'm going to get into ideology in just a few moments. But the Carbonari were the most important. This was their flag. In Naples and the Piedmont, which are areas on the Italian peninsula, that there will be quite a bit of influence by the Carbonari. However, there will be monarchs restored to those areas. When Napoleon had taken over those areas, he had put his own brother in charge of Naples and some other places on the Italian peninsula. When Napoleon is gone, his brother is gone, and there are restored monarchs from the families of monarchs that had been there. Some of these monarchs had promised reform and then had gone against those promises once they came to power. And the opposition by the Carbonari and others is going to turn into revolt, armed revolt. So the restoration of the monarchy is not going to be peaceful at all. The Austrian representative at the Congress of Vienna, von Metternich, is going to be one of the main voices to oppose revolution in any form. And that he's going to draw up what will be known as the Troppau Memorandum in 1820, where these more conservative monarchical regimes are going to be working with each other to suppress revolt. So this is a very strong movement in reaction to those people who wanted the values of revolution put forward. However, revolution is going to catch fire in Latin America. And that is partially because you've got some well-developed economies and a desire, such as it was in Europe, for self-rule. And the idea was to get rid of the Spanish colonizers and the rule by the Kingdom of Spain. Spain is at this moment a very weak kingdom, and so it becomes a moment at which the colonies are going to try to overthrow the rule of the Spanish. Argentina is going to declare its independence. There's going to be fighting in Chile and Peru, And much of this fighting is led by Simón de Bolívar, a very charismatic general who will rally troops and militia to him and fight against the Spanish colonial governments. Colonial governments, or those monarchies that run colonies, or those nations that run colonies, especially if they're overseas, have a very difficult time putting down revolts. It's much easier to put down revolts inside your own country. But if you've got to ship troops and war material across an ocean and feed them, etc., it's very difficult for the colonial troops to win unless there is a very strong infrastructure. And there wasn't for the Spaniards, even though they had been there for quite some time. There will also be a handful of people from Europe who will be joining in these revolutions that will be helping out, just like Marquis de Lafayette had helped in the American Revolution. You're going to see some of the Carbonari are going to be exiled from Europe, and they're going to end up in Latin America and fighting with Simón de Bolívar. There will be one named Garibaldi. I'll talk about him in a moment. And one of the leaders of the revolts in Chile will have the very Hispanic name of O'Higgins. He'll be from Ireland. So there's interesting groups of people doing the fighting, but these are going to be extremely successful revolutions. So a lot of conflict, however. It is going to be very bloody. There will be different gains. Some of the elites wanted to get rid of Spain, knowing that once they got rid of Spain, they would be the people who would take over control. There were radicals who wanted to get rid of slavery and wanted land reforms. So not so much interested in running the government, but making sure that certain human rights are observed for everyone. And the elites are going to be the ones who are eventually going to be successful over the more radical movement. The United States is watching all this happening, and this is the moment in which President Monroe declares the Monroe Doctrine, that is basically trying to tell the crowned heads of Europe to keep out of Latin America. So this is, that fledgling little country of the United States flexing its muscles. Interestingly enough, Great Britain, because she is trying to deal with colonies overseas, is going to start recognizing these South American republics very early and trading with them for economic reasons. The British will treat the South American republics more like more equal trading partners, rather than trying to move in and colonize the area, as Great Britain had done in India, in parts of China, in Africa, and of course, North America. But their attitudes towards Latin America will be very different. They will see them as a trading partner. South America, there are some places where cotton will grow very well, and Great Britain needed cotton, but they also needed oils. And this is predating petroleum. So we're talking about palm oils and nut oils and other things that the British needed to lubricate the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. Brazil will declare its independence from Portugal in 1823. So it's going to be part of this whole movement of revolutions in Latin America too. So all these new nations, the borders are still not entirely set in the early part of the 19th century. As you can probably see, Mexico is extending suspiciously up to very close to the Canadian border, and all of Tejas, Texas, etc. And quite a bit of changes are going to happen here in Central America, and some borders are going to be changing, but this is how it shakes out by about 1830. There's only a handful of areas that are actually under control of different European powers. The British have Guyana, the Dutch have Suriname, and the French have what is called French Guiana, so the British Guiana and French Guiana. The Spanish managed to hang on to Cuba and Puerto Rico. They will lose those by the end of the 19th century. So Tsar Alexander is going to die, still fairly young, in 1825. He had two brothers, and the crown of the Tsar should have passed to his brother Constantine. He had a brother Constantine. And the nobility that was in Russia, especially those who had chased Napoleon all the way to Paris, who had seen what was happening throughout Europe, had been wanting to make some changes in the Russian government, because it was basically an absolute monarchy, and that there was no real representative body or even much of a counselor body to help the Tsar. Everything was bottlenecked at the Tsar. And so there will be a group of army officers who will want reform. And they feel that one of the best ways to do that is to create, under the Tsar, a constitutional monarchy. And so they will have a particular rallying cry, which will be Constantine and Constitution. The joke, of course, that many Russians will make is that the average Russian peasant thought that Constantine would be the Tsar and Constitution was his wife. Anyway, Russian jokes are strange. So the Russians, seeing themselves as the liberators of Europe, they're not just talking about simple, we're not going to have slaves anymore. They're seeing Russia as becoming a dominant power that can dictate policy. And so this group of army officers are going to get together to try to push for these reforms. They wanted to get rid of serfdom, they wanted to curb the Tsar's power, and they wanted to move Russia into a place of true prominence in Europe. They called themselves the Decembrists because Alexander died at the end of November, and they attempt to throw a coup that December. The musical group, the Decembrists, took their name from this particular brief rebellion. However, Constantine is not going to be interested in taking over the crown of the Tsar, but his little brother Nicholas will. Nicholas will take over the crown, and he will violently crush the Decembrists' revolt and either send many people that were supporting the Decembrists' revolt into inner exile into Siberia, and he will round up the ringleaders and hang them. There is a story told about when they went to execute, to hang one of the Decembrists. They are carting him up the scaffolding. They put the rope around his neck. They pull the lever for the door, the trap door, and as the man falls, the rope breaks. So he falls through the trap door, is not hung, and he lands and he breaks both of his legs. Well, they're still going to execute him. So they drag him screaming in agony back up the scaffolding so they can hang him again. And supposedly he shouted out that Russia was so inept they couldn't even hang a man properly. Anyway, Nicholas is going to be a ruthless authoritarian leader, but he will make some changes to the bureaucracy that will help Russia be a little bit more efficient. So he's going to change the legal system. He is not he's going to push the nobility away somewhat so that they can't get in his way, number one, and number two, so they're not likely to start another revolt. He will have a secret police that will be very, very interested in rooting out any sort of people who are disagreeing with him or disagreeing with the Tsar. They are the forerunner of the KGB. A lot of the systems of secret police and prisons in the Siberia, and a lot of the tendencies that the Soviet Union will have as far as authoritarian leadership are going to come directly from Nicholas I. He's going to establish and strengthen the secret police. He's going to establish what will later become the gulags in Siberia. So he is going to also get the landowners to reorganize their estates. It had been a tradition that a landholder would divide up the land after his death to his living relatives, and then those living relatives would divide up the land, and those living relatives would divide up the land, etc. So as the generations went, you started with one very big plot of land, and it kept getting divided up and divided up and divided up into the very family members. And that is very harmful for productivity. So Nicholas I is going to allow for landowners to reorganize these so that they can go back to having bigger farms. The ideas of the people and autonomy and getting rid of outside rule, not going to be just Latin America. It's going to happen in Serbia and Greece as well, because both of those nations had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And here is where, Alexander the First's idea of the Holy Alliance starts to play out, that getting rid of the Ottoman Empire influence in Europe means to get rid of the Ottomans in places like Serbia and Greece. And so we'll see Alexander the First side with those revolutionaries in Serbia, if only because that's they're Christian and the Russians do not want the Muslim influence in Europe. So in this one particular case, we're going to see the Tsars backing a revolutionary movement, more of a rebellion, and Serbia is going to gain something of an independence with Russia as the guarantor of the supporting the country. So this is going to be one slight between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And Serbia, the connection between Serbia and Russia is going to grow very, very close and be very important from this moment on. The Greek War for Independence from the Ottoman Empire is not going to go as well. But the weird thing about the Greek War for Independence is all of the well-educated people in Europe, they all knew about the great golden age of Greece, which was 400 BCE, almost 2,000, over 2,000 years before the fight for Greek independence. So many of the well-educated people in Europe had read Homer, had read Plato, had read Aristotle, had read about Socrates. They imagined Greece as being still full of all of these philosophers, still running around, still coming up with these ideas. Greece had not had that kind of power, both militarily or intellectually, as far as well-educated people, in a very long time. But it had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And so when these first movements towards Greek independence start happening, you're going to see a whole bunch of Europeans go down to help in the fighting. Much like some Europeans went to Latin America to fight under Simón de Bolívar, we're going to have Europeans going to Greece to fight against the Ottoman Empire. They're going to be kind of shocked by what they find, because they're not going to find the big white columns and the people in chitons, togas and everything. They're going to see a fairly poor country. But the rebellion is not going to be as a state wanting to become independent from the colonizers. They're going to cast it as a war between Christianity and Islam. And they're going to push for Greek independence. And eventually the British, the French, and the Russians sent troops to get the Ottomans out of Greece. The Ottomans, of course, are going to get their revenge, so to speak, by storing their gunpowder in the Parthenon, in that beautiful marble sculpture, and it's going to blow up. Much of the damage done is going to be through Ottoman armaments. But this is also a time when Europeans are going to be collecting works of art from Greece. This is how Lord Elgin of England ends up buying the friezes and a bunch of parts of the Parthenon and shipping them all to England, where they are mounted and shown very proudly inside the British Museum. If you ever get a chance to go to the British Museum, you will see what are known as the Elgin marbles. And those were all a bunch of the statuary that Lord Elgin had gotten from Greece. As he claims he bought it. The Greeks, however, want it all back. It's a point of contention now between the Greeks and the British. But this this little war for independence is all of a sudden going to have a whole bunch of monarchs, Christian monarchs, supporting a rebellious band trying to get rid of the Muslim Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks out of Greece. So these movements take on less of a political ideology and more of a reconquista sort of idea of trying to make Europe entirely Christian.
So, Professor, I have a question.
Sir, yeah.
Who are Ottoman?
The Ottoman Turks. These were the Ottoman Turks who took over Byzantium and Constantinople in 1453 CE, and they had ruled it for, well, they're going to be kicked out not until the 20th century, but it is a Ottoman Empire that had made inroads into places in Europe. At one point, they got as far as Vienna and Bratislava in Slovakia, and they will be slowly pushed back, but they will have a very long-lasting influence, and they're going to be the one Muslim influence in Europe when the Muslims are driven out of Spain in 1490.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure. So by 1830, we're going to see open revolts against the kings, against those signatories of the Congress of Vienna. The 1830 revolution in France is going to be an attempt to get rid of the monarch that had been put in place shortly after Napoleon had gone. He wasn't a very popular monarch, and he had pushed to make sure that those French nobles who had lost land and money during the original French Revolution got recompense for it, were compensated for their losses, which was a huge drain on the French treasury, which meant that taxes had to be raised, and guess who paid taxes? Charles X also put the Catholic Church in charge of the French schools, where it was for a very long time before the Revolution and after the Revolution. So having that influence of the Catholic Church over the schools, where during the Revolution they had gotten away from it. He's going to roll back a lot of the reforms that had been made in the meantime, and he's going to restrict suffrage, meaning that he's going to restrict the right for people to vote. In other words, people who could vote all of a sudden could not vote. And so workers and artisans and students are going to stage an uprising. Now, Anne, you said you just watched Les Miserables. This is the moment that they build the barricades. So we're talking 1830 is the building of the barricades at that moment. But the troops, many of them will refuse to fire on the protesters. It's going to be an interesting group of protests. There's going to be some fighting in the streets. There's also going to be, because of the censorship, there are going to be riots in the theater. There will be multiple playwrights and composers of operas who are going to be writing pieces that are critical of the monarchies. And when these pieces are performed, they're going to start riots. So yeah, theater riots, imagine. Weird. Anyway, so Charles X will abdicate in favor of Louis Philippe. So he will be crowned as a constitutional monarch. So a step in the direction towards constitutions, yes, but he is still a monarch. By the way, this is the great painting by Eugène Delacroix about this 1830 revolt. Now, many people insist that it is the original French Revolution. It is not. It is painted in about the 1830 revolt. My husband always says, yes, they were so eager to revolt that the ladies did not bother to put their clothes on properly. Actually, she is an allegorical figure. She is the allegorical figure of liberty, otherwise known in France as Marianne. And when we get to talking about nations and nationhoods, we're going to be talking about allegorical figures for each nation. Marianne is France's symbol. She is holding, of course, the tricolore, the French flag from the Revolution, and she is wearing the red cap, the bonnet rouge, the liberty cap. I should have mentioned this cap when I talked about the French Revolution. It is an ancient symbol that comes to us from Rome. It is a special red cap that was given to slaves who had been freed, manumitted slaves. They were given a red cap to wear so that they would not be captured and taken back into slavery. So in America, in France during the Revolution, and then in Haiti, they will adopt this liberty cap as something of a symbol that people will be slaves no more. And this cap pops up in some very unusual places, such as on the coat of arms of the country of Haiti, such as the coat of arms for the US Army. It has the cuirass, the Roman cuirass, but it's got a staff and it's got the liberty cap on top. So, also, Eugène Delacroix, the painter, put himself into the painting. That's him dressed as a very dapper looking student. And the one character in Les Miserables, the little boy, based on this little character here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Anne?
When I watched the movie and when the students they build the barricade,
Yeah.
but when the army opened fire on them, the people they closed their doors, they didn't let them in. So it's not like a national uprisings or something. I don't Yeah, there are some parts of the movies I don't really understand.
Oh, okay. Not everybody was sympathetic to this rebellion. And so some people did not want to take part. This is also true in the United States. Historians believe that only 1/3 of the people took an active part in fighting for American freedom during the War of Independence, during the American Revolution. They figure 1/3 took an active part in fighting, 1/3 of the population remained loyalists, loyal to the king, and many of them fought for the king. And then another third of the population simply did nothing because they did not want to be involved in the violence.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, this is something you have to keep in mind. Not everybody is pro-rebellion. Was the June Revolution part of the French Revolution? No, well, it's not considered part of the original French Revolution. It is the Revolution of 1830. If you recall last week, I said France is going to undergo several changes of government. This is another change of government that they will have in their history. Belgium, holy Belgium, man, is going to be granted its independence. Now, we haven't even talked about Belgium because it had been ruled over by principalities in the German lowlands. It had been ruled over by France. It will eventually, in the Brabant Rebellion, get its own government. It will be granted by the European powers to become its own country, that it can form its own government, but they had to promise to be neutral. So Belgium in 1830 will gain its own independence, but it will also gain the position of being a neutral country, much like Switzerland. That this neutrality meant that they could not start a war. That neutrality is going to be very important in World War I and World War II. But Belgium will be its own independent country as long as it stays neutral. Poland, they are going to want to gain their independence. They had been pushed by the rule of Constantine, Alexander I's brother. He had been in charge of areas of Poland, and they will revolt against him. They will drive Constantine out of Poland and try to proclaim their own government. This is probably why Constantine was not interested in becoming Tsar. So for a brief time, Poland looks like it's going to be independent, but Tsar Nicholas I will come out of Russia and crush the revolt and put Poland under military rule. So, poor Poland, going to be crushed yet again. I hope you saw the video my husband and I made about Peterloo, because we're going to talk about the political aspects of the Industrial Revolution. because it's not going to be a particularly peaceful time in Great Britain as well. Great Britain is going to look like a very illiberal nation because the representative part of the British government, the House of Commons, those districts that had been chosen traditionally, so 100, 200 years before then, they had divided up Britain and said, okay, you're going to have these many voters in this area and these many representatives. Well, when the Industrial Revolution comes along, you're going to see a whole bunch of new cities grow up, like Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Leicester, that didn't have proper representation. My husband just came home, didn't have proper representation in the parliament. And so the needs and desires of those people in those areas were being ignored. Also, the Whig Party, which was a conservative, somewhat conservative party, we would call it conservative now, they wanted change in Parliament, but it was a change that would favor the business owners, not the laborers, over the agricultural interests. And so the fighting in Parliament is going to be over business owning interests and agricultural interests, rather than taking care of what the government should have been taking care of, and that was the majority of people. So we see lots of bills put out that are helping the wealthy, the landed, the people with capital, but not helping the average worker. And so in 1819, in the city of Manchester, on St. Peter's Field, in August of that year, they will have a meeting. They will invite a special speaker, Henry Hunt, to come and speak, and they will decide to have a non-violent protest, that they will come, hear speeches, try to put their opinions out and ask for reform. There will be a handful of people who will be asking for some really radical stuff, like votes for everybody, including women, just a few. But mostly they're going to be demanding better conditions for laborers, more pay, fewer tariffs on things like agricultural goods, so that they would be affordable for the people, so they could buy bread, and a few other reforms. This was not what the city fathers were interested in, and so they're going to send in the local militia to break up the meeting and arrest the speakers. And the local militia is going to go wading into the crowd of approximately 60,000 people with horses and sabers drawn, swinging as they go. They'll end up killing, how many? Okay, they'll end up killing 17 or 18 people outright, but wounding over 600 people. And they'll, of course, arrest the speakers. I think with what we've been seeing in the past month with Black Lives Matter, you can see how even though groups might gather to be nonviolent, it is the reaction by those in charge, those in power, that can lead to some very ugly things happening. Anyway, this the field where this meeting had been held was called St. Peter's Field, and it was just a few years after the British victory over Napoleon at Waterloo. And so the members of the press will put those two words together and call it Peterloo, and it becomes known as the Peterloo Massacre. Unfortunately, the reaction by Parliament is to pass what are called the 6 laws that make things even worse. Very heavy censorship. If you watch the video, I explain it. We explain it in greater detail. So it's going to take a much longer time to actually reform Parliament. So they will reform in 1832 to try to get rid of what they call the rotten boroughs, which were voting districts that had very small numbers of people. They were mainly agricultural districts where most of the people had left the land, and so they had quite a bit of representation in these areas that had very few people. So they're going to readjust the boundaries of the voting districts. Parliament is going to abolish slavery in the colonies, except for India. They'll call it something else so they can get away with it, but that abolitionist movement is going to be strong. And eventually by 1846, they're going to repeal the Corn Laws, which had put tariffs on imported wheat and other grains. In Great Britain, they call wheat and rye and most grains corn, and what we call corn, they call maize. So they're going to get rid of those tariffs so that there's a problem with the prices fluctuating, and then food from outside of Great Britain can come in. Very important in 1848 because, as I'll talk about later, that is a moment in which something called the Irish potato famine happens, in which there are some very bad harvests, and then a blight comes through and kills off the potato crops in Ireland and in Germany, or in the German lowlands, because when they had brought potatoes from the New World, they had only brought one type of potato. So when a blight went through, it killed everything. So it was this monocultural planting that was very, very bad for that. But the Corn Laws are going to be repealed. So very, very slowly, these reforms are going to take place. But in Great Britain, there's going to be quite a bit of rebellion, of violence, and people pushing for these. In the middle of 1848, or a little bit before that, we're going to see the Chartist movement. This was a petition called the People's Charter that demanded white male suffrage, demanded a secret ballot, demanded an end to property qualifications for running and voting for offices, insisted on annual elections, not elections every once in a while, insisted on salaries for those serving in the House of Commons. if you were voted in and you weren't independently wealthy, then you could not, you would essentially starve to death. So this whole list of reforms are going to be written up, and this People's Charter is going to be passed around as a petition to be signed. And this petition will get 6 million signatures. And in April of 1848, a group of workers will carry those 6 million signatures on the People's Charter to Parliament. And because it's April of 1848, we can have a photograph. And this is one of the earliest protest movements that is captured by a camera. And it shows the size of the crowd and them bringing the charter. And there's speeches and there's flags. The technology of cameras at this time is such that it takes a very long exposure to expose the nitrate solution on the glass plate. So instead of a quick click of the lens as it's opening, as later cameras is going to happen, it's going to be open for a little bit longer and then close. And if you're not holding perfectly still, you're going to get all fuzzy. So you can see the wind is blowing, so it's moving the flags around. There's people that are blurry, they're moving around. This guy is obviously standing stock still. Interestingly enough, this horse is standing very still. Most horses disappear because they are moving around, but you can see the people moving. Anyway, I just love these early photographs. But a newspaper can say 25,000 people gathered, but to see a picture of it changes people's attitudes towards how many people showed up. So I want to talk about this and then we'll take a break. The movement towards the abolition of slavery. It is a movement that does not start with the Enlightenment figures of, the followers of John Locke. It is a movement that starts essentially in the church, mainly the Church of England, the more radical elements of the Church of England. And they will start gathering and petitioning to Parliament to ban the slave trade. The British not only had colonies where slaves were, but they had been making a huge amount of money on the slave trade, moving those bodies across the ocean. If you were watching the news a couple of weeks ago, in the town of Bristol, there was a group that tore down a statue of one of these men who had been a slave trader. Colston, I believe, was his name. They tore his statue down and threw it into the bay. And he was a man of the city who was very wealthy, making his money on the slave trade, and did a whole bunch of philanthropic things for the city, but still his money came from the slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade is going to be banned in Great Britain by 1808. And this is going to be meaningful for the Americans because this is after the Haitian Revolution. This is all of a sudden Great Britain is no longer bringing slaves over, and that's as ugly as talking about this in terms of economics, that's going to change the value of slavery at that moment. There will be religious revivals in the United States and England that are going to push for this abolitionist movement. It's not until after the 1830s that we see people like William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown take a little bit different attitude towards this in the United States. But in England, it's going to be a movement through the church. That's also going to be sponsored by Prince Albert, or the Queen's consort, the wife of the husband of Queen Victoria. He will be an outspoken proponent of abolition. There will be such movements as the former slave trader John Newton will be describing his conversion experience from being a slave trader to being a pro-abolition pastor in the hymn Amazing Grace, where he describes that journey. But it is important to remember that the abolition movement gets a lot of its fuel through the white, British, and American anti-slavery people, but it will also be freed slaves who will be writing and traveling and making speeches and encouraging people to become pro-abolitionists. Ignacio Sancho and Olaudah Equiano will be two men from Haiti, I believe, who will become eloquent speakers and writers traveling throughout Europe and into Great Britain, speaking against slavery. So definitely it is not just a movement by white people that the African slaves were themselves very important parts of this movement. And women were an important part of the abolition movement. Women, for the first time, were taking up ideas in politics and pushing those ideas, signing petitions, and raising money for the abolitionists' cause. And one way they raised money was creating buttons, brooches, and these were designed and created by Josiah Wedgwood. You might have heard of Wedgwood China. Well, he created this medallion, and they sold thousands of them. And he was an abolitionist too. He created these medallions, and they were sold and worn especially by women to announce that they were abolitionists. So it was a way to raise money for the abolitionist movement. And these medallions, I don't know if you can read, it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And it shows, obviously, an African in chains. If you recall, in the past 2 weeks, there has been a discussion about the Emancipation statue in Washington, D.C., and it's a statue of Abraham Lincoln standing over a kneeling slave. But the slave has got his chains broken. And there's a lot of people who object to this statue now because it shows the African American in a subservient position. But I contend the statue itself was paid for by ex-slaves and created in the late 1860s. So it was not it was not created by a whoop. Yeah, Yara, you had a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself if you've got a question.
Yes. So I was saying, like, I just wanted to ask, it's really
Sure.
crazy because I know that Abraham Lincoln, he's the one who fought for human rights.
Right.
So why they want to put the statues down?
The sure.
Just like doesn't make sense for me.
This is why the statue hasn't been torn down yet, is that the story behind the statue is a compelling story. It's not like one of those statues that was meant to show oppression. It is stated, the statue itself makes a statement that to our eyes today maybe is questionable, that we have a problem with it, but there's also the fact that it was the ex-slaves who raised the money for it. So that's why they're still arguing about it. I don't know if it's coming down or not. I've been watching to see what happens, but this is one of the problems with statues, is that they might mean something different now than when they were created. Does that help understand, help you?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you very much for asking. But you can see from this medallion that perhaps the idea of the kneeling slave was very much on the forefront of people's mind when they were making the emancipation statue. So I don't know. I've been on arguments on Twitter with various historians, and some are like, no, we've got to get rid of it, and others are like, well, but wait a minute, it reflects an important piece of history. So anyway, there are going to be not just abolitionist movements and petitions and raising money, but there's going to be slave rebellions. The one in Haiti, of course, going to be successful. The Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia will not be so successful in the long run. Louisiana, South Carolina, Barbados, Jamaica, all of these places will have slave revolts and attempts for slaves to free themselves. And at this point in time, there is very few, there's no slave traffic that the British are fostering. There might have been other groups that were bringing slaves over. I haven't studied it in that detail, so I don't know how many, but this is now a aspect of this whole movement into this period that we're still arguing about slavery. And of course, it's going to be in America until 1860 63, 64. So, so by 1838, Great Britain will emancipate 800,000 slaves in its colonies. 10 years later, French revolutionaries will emancipate slaves in the French colonies, and all of those new nations in Latin America, most of them, will eliminate slavery as well. So you've got two very important movements here. You've got three, actually. You've got the slaves trying to free themselves. You have a group of interested people who want to end it. And then you've got the elites on top who are making laws to end it. So it's a very interesting and complex sort of thing that's happening. And in America, it's amazingly complex. Okay. I need to take a break. Can we come back at 10 minutes to 8? So at 7:50, I would like to see if we can take a break, and then I'll get into the weeds when it comes to ideology. Does anybody have any questions for me before the break?
Professor, can I
Yes,
speak
sir.
to you after class?
Sure. Yeah, I'll stay around.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to pause the recording and mute my mic. If you guys want to chat with each other, go right ahead. But I'm going to go get something cold to drink. Congratulations, you guys, going on. That's exciting. All right.
So, Professor, do Nova have any limit capacity for a class?
The one, they limit my classes to 35 students. The one on campus, they're allowing me to have it in the theater. So the theater holds, I think, 200 people. So 35 people spread out over 200 seats. We can get a lot of social distancing in there. And I'm going to insist on everyone wearing a mask and keeping social distancing. So that should be interesting. I've been looking at what kind of mask do I need? Yeah, because it's
Campus you're teaching?
Nada, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm asking on which campus you are teaching.
Oh, Loudon.
Loudon.
Yeah. All right. Have I got recording running? All right. All right, I need to get into the concept of ideologies. Having special interest groups was not anything new in terms of if there are a group of people that want one side or one position supported, that goes back to the dear old Greeks and of course also to the Romans and the Roman Republic and when they had the tribune system. But political parties are something pretty new. Now, parliaments like the British Parliament had different political factions. And one way to organize these political factions is around ideology. And these ideologies are basically statements of what the principles of the political parties are. Now, here in history, when we're talking about the 19th century, and when we're talking about not only politics, but economics and some other subjects, we tend to break our ideologies down into two basic ones: liberals and conservatives. I like to keep these definitions separate than our current political parties. And I do that for one main reason. Political parties have to get elected. Ideologies don't. As one person in the discussion mentioned, let me see if I can find that, because it was a nice little encapsulation. Yes. It was on who said, when it comes to elections, voters tend to stick to the party that has the most sound ideology to them without knowing what that ideology is. Ezra Klein wrote in his article on Vox that most people are a Republican or a Democrat before they are a conservative or a liberal. And most people will stick with their party long after they've abandoned their ideology. And I think I love that statement. Political parties have to get elected, ideologies don't. And so we often find that political parties kind of pick and choose from their ideologies. And so to have any meaningful way of being able to discuss this, we need to discuss the ideologies. And then we can talk about the politics. So I'm going to start with conservatism. Conservatism. Ugh, I always put an extra syllable in there, which is the legitimacy as a general anti-revolutionary policy. Basically, classical conservatives of the 19th century believed that the monarchy was the most important aspect, that it guaranteed political stability, that conservatives tend to value stability and order and hierarchies, and that when there is a change, it must be slow and incremental and managed. The real father of conservatism is an Englishman by the name of Edmund Burke, who wrote a book called The Reflections on the Revolution in France. He had been to France, he had seen what was going on in the revolution, and he opposed it. As he says in his book, they cared for their laws too much and for their fellow human too little. That's what led to the terror, the reign of terror. That natural rights are not what they seem to be. So this classical conservatism does not look into natural rights and the ideas of individual rights. They're more interested in the good of the group. And that his book insists on deference to experience, tradition, and history as guide. So the idea of, but we've always done this way, is not a bad idea to a conservative. Another couple of the important conservative writers and thinkers, Joseph de Maistre and Louis Gabriel Ambroise Bonald, are both men who had, they were minor nobility, who get exiled out of France or leave France during the Revolution and go to other places where they put their ideas into books. And they both champion the monarchy, aristocracy, and the church as the ways for society to maintain order. So these established organizations. De Maistre ends up in Russia and is part of Catherine the Great's court. Spends his life there. If you've ever read War and Peace, the very first chapter is a salon in St. Petersburg, where everyone's excited because there is this Frenchman, this French aristocrat coming to visit, and a good chunk of the first chapter is in French because they're speaking French back and forth. The man is de Maistre. The man is Joseph de Maistre. He ends up in the novel War and Peace, at least for the first chapter. Liberalism is not a little bit different. It's a lot different. And liberalism believes that the most important function of government was to protect individual liberties and natural rights, promoting justice, knowledge, progress, and prosperity. So this is classical liberalism. I'm not talking about the Democratic Party. The idea of individual rights means equality before the law, that the government rests upon the consent of the governed, and laissez-faire political principle, economic principles. So the politics, the ideas of government, and economics go closely hand in hand with liberalism. John Locke is, of course, the big starter of this, and it also grows out of the Enlightenment thinkers. So ideas like freedom of the press, freedom from arbitrary authority, imprisonment, and censorship, the right to assemble, and written constitutions. These are all, hallmarks of liberalism. Note, we're not talking about tradition. We're not talking about monarchy. We're not talking about doing things the same way we've always done it, but basically creating a government that respects all the individual liberties. No one is more special than the other, although they will advocate that direct representation in government should be just for property owners. This was true way back in the Roman Republic, was that you could not be in the army without owning property. The idea being that if you own property, you have something to fight for. If you own property, you're going to be voting more carefully because it's in your direct interest. Okay. So in terms of the economic principles, you want to be reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, getting rid of mercantilism. Mercantilism was of a benefit to conservatives because mercantilism fostered the idea that only certain people should be able to get to trade, and that the government should control aspects of trade. So economic liberalism is against mercantilism, and that the economy could run very much like the political entity, with you identifying basic economic laws that are kind of analogous to laws in an ordered society, supply and demand, trade, balance of trade, these sort of things. The science of economics was just in its infancy at this time, and so you had men like Malthus and Ricardo who are going around announcing these laws of wages and rents, supply and demand, the free market, that sort of thing. They didn't understand it fully, but just the idea of allowing these things to happen, laissez-faire economics, rather than the king decides prices and the king decides who gets to trade and the king decides X, Y, and Z. It's very different. So you can see where liberalism and the laissez-faire economics go well together. But a important step is taking off the constraints of trade, that labor should be contracted freely. A classic liberal would be against a trade union, that every laborer should negotiate their own contract, what they could get. Property unencumbered by feudal restrictions, meaning that people could buy and sell property whenever and whatever, whenever they wanted to, as long as they had the title to it, as opposed to property only being owned by certain people, and it stayed in that family and was almost never sold off. So also getting rid of government granted monopolies. That's a huge step towards the liberal economic tradition, because many practices such as printing were done by government granted monopolies. Printers had to join a guild and they had to bid for government contracts and that sort of thing. So an end to those monopolies was something that classical liberal would want. But that the government should preserve order and protect property, and that way everybody can do their business. Now, aside from liberals and liberals and conservatives, we're going to get into more political parties as opposed to ideologies. So now we're seeping into the political parties. Those people who were Republicans, now this is not our Republican Party here in the United States. These Republicans tended to be classical liberals. That's why I'm saying we can't be thinking about today's political party. A Republican wants governments by the people, and a franchise, expanded franchise, and democratic participation in politics. A Republican is going to want a constitution that defends the rights of the individuals. But Republicans are very anti-monarchy, that every individual should be allowed to participate in government. This is a copy of a Republican banner that was carried at Peterloo. Equal representation or death. Kind of like DC, taxation without representation. Another political movement was socialism. Okay, we are not at this moment talking about Karl Marx. Socialism predated Karl Marx and communism. Socialism was a response to industrialization. And it was following some of Adam Smith's ideas that he laid out in The Wealth of Nations, that it is the added labor, that someone doing the work is a source of wealth. Before Adam Smith, the idea was that the source of wealth is agriculture. You own land, you grow things, you sell things, that is wealth. Early socialists would say, no, it's the labor that people put into growing or to making a product that is the source of its value. They believed in competition and individualism and private property. So they weren't communists as we know of today. They also believed that society could be both industrial and humane, that there was a way to make industry something that was better. And in fact, we're going to see quite a few different examples of people trying to use socialism, early socialism, to create a better society. Most notable, Robert Owen will build a model workshop at New Lanark, which is in Scotland. It is a mill that had been there, a textile mill. He bought it and decided to turn it into a model village where people cooperated and they put money back into the factory rather than the owner of the factory taking all the money and going. They organized decent housing, they organized sanitation, they put in a free school, and they had Social Security for those workers who could no longer work because they were getting too old. They had a system to help pay for those people. Another early socialist, Charles Fourier, is going to talk about abolishing the wage system and allowing people to work based on what they wanted to do or their natural inclinations, not just forcing them into any old job. So it allowed, he insisted that people could self-actualize in their work and that they would be happier and do better work. He also believed in the equality of sexes, which was a pretty radical idea. Another person who believed in the equality of the sexes was Flora Tristan, who actually talked to workers to try to find out what they liked, what they wanted, what their needs were. Louis Blanc is going to be another reformer, socialist, who was hoping to make the worker as an important aspect of the government, taking the worker and giving them a place and a say in government, and giving them a share of the profits. because if you've only got the rich in government, they're only writing rules and regulations to benefit themselves. If you get the worker, then you're going to get rules that are going to help. And there's a, you get the end of the spectrum, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who is going to be more radical than any of these guys, who is going to announce property is theft. So, and Abel wanted to get rid of, abolish private property altogether. So yeah, they went out, a few of them went out on a limb pretty far. But this is this drawing of Robert Owen's model community. This is the classroom at New Lanark with the housing. You can see through the windows of the housing. The children got to go to school, that Robert Owen invested in teachers, in learning materials. He wrote a book on education. The boys and girls all dressed the same. That was a little weird, but he taught them not just lessons, but taught them music, taught them dancing. It was a very well-rounded school. So it was very much a modern community. And in fact, you can go to New Lanark now. Well, actually, it's closed because of COVID-19, but this is the same classroom. They have taken the building and fixed it up. They have used the exact image to recreate some of the drawings and everything. And so you can see what the classroom was like. And the boys and girls sat next to each other on these benches. They had slates to write things down. And it was a very cool place. This is, I took these pictures. We visited New Lanark last June, and it was so much fun. But it's still a working mill. They still have a lot of the old equipment and the water wheels that drove it. And they make they weave special yarns and knit products. And if you've watched the Harry Potter films, and they all had scarves on that had the house colors, those were made at the New Lanark mill. They're really proud of that. So they do specialized weaving there still. But socialism, as we understand it, changed with Karl Marx. Marx was studying to be a philosopher, but of course there's not a lot of money in that. He was influenced by Hegel's philosophy, and the material and the dialectic. And so he's going to become a journalist because there's no money in philosophy. He's going to be part of, or at the very beginnings of a movement of a democratic or a Republican movement in the German lands, and then he gets exiled to Paris. He moves to Brussels, and then he moves to London. So he tries for a while to publish a newspaper in Germany, and then he eventually gets kicked out and moves around and ends up in England and meets up with Friedrich Engels, another German who actually owns a textile manufacturing firm in Manchester. And he and Marx start talking about how to change the conditions of the working class in England. They write a book on that. And Marx basically tries to come up with some theories about workers and about socialism and about communism and some of the ideas of creating a new political movement based on workers. They join a group that is called the League of the Just, which the name changes to the Communist League.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Marcus, do you know if Marcus criticized the Russian regime?
The Mark has decided to what?
No, he criticized the Russian regime.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Marx's book, Das Kapital, where one of his earlier books talks about the capitalist system and what's wrong with it. That all relationships in a capitalist system are money relationships, in that everything about capitalism is exchange of money. His observations about capitalism, I think, are very interesting. But when he starts writing the Communist Manifesto, he starts coming up with what he calls the laws of history. And speaking as a professional historian, they're a load of hooey, because he insists that history repeats itself. So I'm gonna give you my 5-minute encapsulation of Karl Marx's ideas about the laws of history. Do I need a whiteboard? Yeah, I'll get a whiteboard on this. All right. So, Marx will insist that all relationships are class-based relationships, and that over time they change, but it's always a struggle of one class against another class. And that he outlines the idea that at the beginning of time, you had two basic classes, the master class and the slave. And over time, this relationship comes into conflict with each other, and they have what is in essence a revolution. So you have the master drop. So you have the master and the slave coming into conflict with each other, and at some point that gets into a cataclysm, a violent thing happens. Boom, 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 boom. That's violence right here. And Marx called that point the nexus. N-E-X-U-S. And that once you go through the nexus, then you come to a new class relationship. And that new class relationship so you have that new development, the lord and the peasant. and eventually they're going to come into conflict. And they're going to come to another nexus. That's violent. And of course, Marx labeled that nexus the French Revolution. And he says, then you go into another set of relationships. The bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. So you go from master and slave, you have a nexus, you get the lord and the peasant, you have another nexus, which he called the French Revolution, and then you come out into the Industrial Revolution, where you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he says, eventually, what is going to happen in this relationship is that they're going to come to a head. And what's going to happen is that the bourgeois is going to gain what he calls class consciousness. Class consciousness. And class consciousness for the proletariat means that he no longer needs the bourgeois, the owner, because what makes a bourgeois is the ownership of the means of production. I'll type that since. And Marx says at some point the proletariat is going to realize they don't need to allow the bourgeoisie to have the means of production in their own hand, that the proletariat will come to class consciousness. They will realize that they can take over the means of production. And that's when you get the final nexus, the big revolution right here. And then what happens is that the proletariat takes over. There is no more class distinction, and you get true communism. And this is what history will do from here on out. That history ends, and it's just communism. And everyone owns the means of production. They self-actualize in terms of everyone having the jobs that they want to do. Everything is shared in common, because part of what separates these two is that the master, the lord, and the bourgeoisie have all of the belongings, and the slave, the peasant, and the proletariat do not. But if everything is shared in common, according to Karl Marx, then society becomes equal. There is no more class struggle. So that's my nutshell, my Marx in a nutshell, the idea that history repeats itself, I have real problems with. The idea that this is a law, I have problems with. And of course, this is why people have been afraid of communism for so long, is that they have been told, according to Marx's Communist Manifesto, that this last revolution is going to happen any day. Lenin insisted that the Russian Revolution was that nexus, and he was quite surprised when it wasn't. And then there's going to be 70 years of economists and philosophers and politicians in the Soviet Union trying to explain why it really wasn't and what was going wrong. But they have always held that Marx's laws of history were going to happen. And so when the capitalists in the West have internalized this idea that this revolution is imminent, it's going to happen, and we're all going to lose our possessions, and the workers will seize control of the state will wither away, religion will wither away, according to Karl Marx. It is utopian pie in the sky sort of thinking, wishful thinking. As soon as those proletariats get smart enough, then they're going to be able to take over. So his ideas hold a huge amount of sway even today. You will see people decrying communism and socialism and all this. Just keep in mind, this was ideas from a man in the middle of the 19th century who had never run a business before. Well, he had ran a newspaper, but it had failed. And who had these weird ideas about the laws of history, but it's all his, in the words of the dude, that's like just your opinion, man. And to have so many people for so many generations take it as absolute fact that it was going to happen. It's kind of why I get frustrated with politics today, is that we're still dealing with 150-year-old opinions rather than coming up with something better. Anyway, I'm on a rant, sorry. Marx does that to me. But one thing that Marx was against, that basically is this new baby coming out of a cradle, is the concept of nation. Now, I've studied a lot about nationalism. My master's thesis was on symbols used to create nationalism. Nationalism is something that has puzzled people since the French Revolution. It comes from the Latin word nasci, to be born. So it is where you are born. It used to be thought of, there's a spectrum that nationalism occurs on. And there is one end of the spectrum that says, and this is a very old-fashioned idea, that it's in your blood. Your grandparents were born in Germany. That makes you a German. That means you love Sauerbraten and beer and all these German things. So the idea that it was in your blood, a sanguine sort of idea. A lot of uh, uh, researchers, they've moved way far away from that. That is like one very far end of the spectrum. They've also moved into the opposite end of the spectrum, saying it's all made up. There's nothing to it. It is an accident of where you were born. There is, there's nothing about having your grandparents being born in Germany that makes you a German because you've been born in America or whatever. I always use the example of I'm half Italian. That means I talk with my hands. Oops. But if it was in my blood, then I, as a half-blooded Italian, should be able to speak Italian beautifully. I can't, not at all. I mean, my dear grandmother only taught me a couple of Italian words. None of them were cuss words, so it's absolutely not useful. But the idea that it's all made up has been argued as well. There are certain researchers that talk about that it's the language that makes you whatever nation you are. I find it, as much as I've studied it, it is extremely difficult to say this is it, because it has changed so much and it changes from person to person. Now, patriotism is something different. To me, patriotism is the action of being a partisan, a supporter of one's nation. But nationalism itself, now citizenship, that's a legal term. To be a citizen, there are certain hoops you have to jump through, or you're born, the natural born citizenship, or taking the mantle of citizenship. And we have been arguing for years about who is a citizen, who isn't a citizen. How do you treat members of a nation? Do all the laws that you get, the rights that you get as a citizen of a nation, why doesn't everybody get those same rights? I mean, just because you were born here means that it's okay to abuse these other people. There's a huge number of things to argue about nationalism and citizenship and patriotism. But the idea of a citizen of a nation as opposed to a subject of a king, the French Revolution changed that. Basically said, you're no longer a subject of a king, you are the sovereign people, the people who rule the land. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as Abraham Lincoln said. That's what we mean by the sovereign people. But the nation itself is a political community. It's not just a territory. The people who live in Alaska are not close to America, the United States, and yet they are United States citizens, and they got that way because Seward, Secretary of State, spent $7.5 million, and all of a sudden, congratulations, you're all Americans now. Good. Professor, I'm sorry, I can see on the whiteboard on the screen. Are you using PowerPoint? Am I? Thank you very much. Okay, I hope you can see the screen then. Okay, one of the real profound thinkers of nationalism called it a imagined community, which I love that idea, is that we as a nation imagine all of each other in a community. We might not speak the same language, although this particular thinker, his name is Anderson, says newspapers, that everybody picks up the same newspapers and reads them. It's that we create these imagined communities. I love to think of the internet as an imagined community. You have virtual friends. A lot of us have friends that we've never met, but we hold discussions and speak about deep things to them in chat rooms, on Discord, on Facebook, although I know you guys are too cool to use Facebook, 4chan, Reddit. You can get into some interesting conversations with people. You can also get in interesting arguments with people, and that's a imagined community as well. Do we call it a nation? Well, good. Anyway, but in the early 19th century, nationalism was symbolized by legal equality, a constitutional government, and an end of feudal privilege, and that the aristocratic elite, those people who were involved in the monarchy, did not like nationalism as well, because those people who have an adherence to a nation rather than a king or an aristocratic elite, it's harder to control their sympathies. It's harder to control them and get them to do what you want them to do. However, you can also use this idea of nation to motivate people. You can get people to go fight and die for your nation. You can get people to do all sorts of things for your nation. So if we're just saying it's all made up, that seems like a really crazy idea. So it's interesting. It's hours and hours of discussion. So that nations are basically the people becoming this common group. And the liberals, the classical liberals, were very much identified with the nations, and yet it's not going to stay that way. The conservatives started out by really hating nations, and then they're going to find out how useful they are. When we talk about the nation, we're talking about mainly the people and the organizations within it. When we're talking about the state, however, we're talking about the power structure. And I'm using, these are terms as political scientists would use them. We're talking about the nation of the United States, but the state is the government. And developing national feelings allows for the government to do things with the support of the people. And remember, the people have to be the sovereign people of the state. The linking of citizenship to the state, because it is, after all, the state that grants you your rights, and the education system is where you inculcate the citizens to be citizens. Um, why do you think that in classrooms for many, many years, students stood up and said the Pledge of Allegiance? That is an inculcation, pardon me, of nationalism. Singing the national anthem before sports games. That's another inculcation. And also inventing a national heritage. Some of the questions I've been asking people is about uh, national anthems and music. That's part of our national heritage. Flags, symbols, all that stuff, you know, the important buildings downtown, the monuments. All of this is part of a national heritage. So these statues that people want to leave up or tear down, that's part of our national heritage too. So there's a lot there to argue about. But one of the main ways they divided up these nations in Europe was by language groups. Now, we're not saying particular languages because not everyone on the Italian peninsula in the 19th century spoke Italian. The Czechs spoke one language, the Slovaks spoke another, the Hungarians spoke another. German was spoken throughout this area, but there were differences. A person from Munich in the south sounded a lot different from a person in Hamburg in the north. So there's all these language groups to consider as well. So language is not an automatic definer of nations, but it is one of the ways they determine. So, breaking into this part, one of the most important movements of the 19th century was a cultural movement called Romanticism. Now, it's not people being in love and kissing and everything. That's not what we mean by Romanticism. What we mean by Romanticism is it is a reaction to the Age of Enlightenment. It is a movement away from classicism and reason and logic and discipline. Romantics embraced emotion and freedom and imagination as a way to learn about the world. It was very much an individual and subjective experience. It was different for everybody. And instead of reasoning your way through a problem, they believed in using your guts, using your emotions, using your intuition and feelings as the guides to truth. They felt that the truth is out there and you might stumble upon it someday. It's a shame that they put so much in this chapter, because there's so much to talk about when we talk about Romanticism. It was such an important movement. Poetry was extremely popular. As you can well imagine, because it has a certain way of using words to encouraging you to use your imagination. William Wordsworth, one of the topic discussion questions, I gave you a Wordsworth poem that, let me see if I can find it. Okay. poem is called "The World is Too Much with Us," and it is William Wordsworth talking about nature and that it is our great teacher, and that he would rather be in nature rather than subjugating it as, we're taking over nature here. It's a lovely little poem. That's why I left it in there. So if you're going through the discussion topics, take a look at it. By the way, I extended the due date for those. This week is so crazy that I'm just giving you some extra time. Did anyone manage to get to that discussion question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Professor,
Mhm.
this is Shubhamir. So
Yeah.
since you mentioned that you have extended the date, I just saw it. It's due on July 17th. And is
Yes.
that the right date?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So both the discussions for chapter 20 and chapter 21 are on July 17th.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they're both posted, and they're due at that moment.
Okay.
So,
That
Thank
time.
you.
Yeah.
Professor, I have a question.
Sure.
If I post more than comments, it's okay?
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd love for you to look at other people's comments, comment on that, as long as it's kept reasonable
No,
and polite.
if I post my idea more than
Okay,
comments.
that's fine. That's fine. So,
Go ahead.
okay, another poet, William Blake. He's an interesting poet because he was also a lithographer and a painter as well as a poet. This is the image shows his poem, The Tiger, Tiger, Tiger burning bright in the forest of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? And he did the artwork as well. And he had so many volumes printed up, and he painted it and everything. And it's a very impressive piece of work. But he also was a critic of industry. A lot of romantics loved nature and loved the purity of nature and hated what the Industrial Revolution was doing to nature. Another poet, Lord Byron, was an aristocrat, but he was a nonconformist. He was one of these people that the people of the middle class would have hated because he had crazy, radical politics and free lifestyle and lots of sex with women who were not his wife. And ran around with his buddy Percy Bysshe Shelley, who also had a fascinating life. Both men died very young. That was stylish. Byron died in the Greek War of Independence. He was one of these crazy people that went to fight for the Greeks and was horrified by what he found and died of disease while he was in Greece. Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote some very incredible poems about romantic heroism and the labor movement. Those two men were friends, and they vacationed together in the summer of 1817 in a nice house in Switzerland, I believe on the shores of Lake Como. And they brought their wives, but supposedly there was some crazy sex going on. It was also a weird summer because there had been a major volcanic eruption in the South Pacific. I can't remember the name of the volcano. It started with a T. Anyway, this volcano threw so much ash so high into the atmosphere, people couldn't see the ash, but it caused global cooling for an entire year. In Pardon?
Is this the one in Indonesia?
Yes, yes. And it cooled everything for an entire year. It was called the summer without the sun. It was raining constantly. And so the foursome, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Bysshe Shelley, and I can't remember who Lord Byron brought, they were stuck inside the whole time because it was raining the whole time. And they decided to come up with, they had a contest to pass the time. And their contest was who could write the scariest book or story. They were trying to create horror stories. And Percy Bysshe Shelley's wife, Mary Godwin Shelley, who was the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the early feminists. We mentioned her a couple of chapters back, going toe-to-toe with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Mary Wollstonecraft couldn't come up with a story. She was racking her brain, and then she had a nightmare about a scientist reanimating corpses with electricity. And she was horrified, but she went ahead and wrote it, and that became the novel Frankenstein. And if I was teaching this class in the normal 15, 16-week format, I would have you all read Frankenstein, because I love that novel. It is a romantic novel. It has so many themes in it. Like a good story, you can look at it a lot of different ways, whether it was the genius of Victor Frankenstein, the scientist gone wrong, whether the monster was a stand-in for Shelley, who found herself just because of her situation, found herself on the outs, wanting to be back in society. I mean, it's just this amazing novel that's got so many different ways to look at it. But that's what happened that summer. She came up with the winning book, and it's been made into films. Don't bother with the films. That no one's gotten the films quite like the book. It is very much worthwhile to sit down and read the novel if you get a chance, because it is fascinating and there's so many themes in it. But it's, if you see the movies with the big green guy with the flat head and the bolts in his neck, that's nothing like the book. For one thing, Frankenstein was the doctor, not the monster. The monster never gets a name. The monster is merely called the creation.
She had a muscle. Huh?
Yeah, he had a lot of muscles. Yeah, he built him. The Victor Frankenstein built the creature very muscly, which was kind of stupid because the monster goes off and kills everybody that Victor Frankenstein loves. Very creepy. Romantic painting. This is a style of painting that it goes away from the perfect paintings of Jacques Louis David, which every detail is just right. And in fact, details kind of go out the window. They're painting to evoke an emotion, using their individual techniques, their brush strokes, their color. They are extremely subjective and imaginative. John Constable created these beautiful landscapes with these thick clouds. And he's not painting in detail, he's painting with gesture, and it's just beautiful. And Turner, who really upset a lot of people. There were riots at his gallery openings, that people were offended by his paintings because they were so wild. But it took me forever. There's a railroad and a bridge and another bridge over here, and you've got a little guy in a boat, and it's like, it's hard to tell what's going on, but the colors are so beautiful and fascinating that you just can't keep your eyes off of it. And a few expressed in very close details, but the topics are out of this world. Absolutely hard to believe. But a lot of use of myth, especially Greek and Roman and ancient Nordic myths and fairy tales, that sort of thing. And of course, I showed you a Delacroix earlier. He is not going to be painting just pictures of revolutions, but really he's interested in all sorts of different foreign objects. The women of Algiers, two women smoking a hookah, which would have been quite, for a European audience, quite risque. Are they wearing pants? Another risque thing. This would have been incredibly foreign, but the beauty of the cloth and the beautiful designs just evokes such a lovely feeling. The writers, of course, are going to be writing beautiful long novels about life. That is basically, well, when you get to Victor Hugo, Victor Hugo wrote a couple of very impressive novels. Notre Dame de Paris, which he published in 1831, a very early novel of his. We know it better as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. A fascinating look at medieval Paris, and looking at it through the eyes of a very cruel priest and a hunchback who's actually got a beautiful soul, and they're both in love with the same woman who is a gypsy. And then, of course, his great book Les Miserables, which is a book that asks the question, am I my brother's keeper? And Victor Hugo's answer is, you're damn right you're your brother's keeper. What are you doing about it? How are you helping people? Your job here on earth is to help people. So it's a gorgeous book. Francois de Chateaubriand is going to be writing about religion. Religious experience also fits into this romantic period that we see a lot of religion expressed. Yes, Nicole?
Huh?
Hi, Nicole, you had a question?
Oh no.
Oh, okay, great. Um, so the so you will see a lot of writings about religion, but this is also a time when Sir Walter Scott is writing about Ivanhoe. There is a rebirth of interest in the Gothic, the medieval period, and it's where we get a lot of our ideas about heroes from. And as I said, they went back into mythology. They also looked into nations in terms of culture. Johann von Herder is going to be really one of the early thinkers about nations, but he's going to say that nations are held together by culture, and that civilization arises from the Volk, the people, not the elites. Don't look at the kings if you want to find out about a nation. You look at the people, and that every nation is different because each nation has its own genius, as he called it, its heritage. This is also the moment that the Brothers Grimm is running around collecting fairy tales, Grimm's fairy tales, Snow White, Rose Red, Hansel and Gretel. These are all German folk tales that had, until the Brothers Grimm, been orally passed down from parent to child, and the Brothers Grimm write it up, and these fairy tales, believe it or not, become an avenue for Germans to express their national genius, their culture, because all of a sudden now they have that in front of them, where before they might have heard one or two fairy tales. Now they've got a whole collection of them. The story of William Tell, and I know you you might have heard of the story of William Tell. He's the guy that shoots the apple off of his son's head. The story of how he is forced to do that by an evil occupying government, however. And this story is retold. It's an old tale that's retold by Friedrich Schiller, who tells it as a reaction to people who have come over and taken over parts of Germany who aren't German. So trying to encourage that idea of Germanness and the German national consciousness. Now, the book William Tell is going to be turned into an opera by Giacomo Rossini called Guglielmo Tell, or William Tell. And it's a political opera. Opera was not something that people in tuxedos and ball gowns and top hats only went to. Opera was a very lively, exciting art form that a lot of people enjoyed because, no television, no radio, so it was gorgeous music set to a story, a good story, and people enjoyed it. But opera, like William Tell, like Friedrich Smetana's The Barter Bride, and Giuseppe Verdi's Nabucco, these are all very nationalistic operas, even though they're set in the far past. They are telling stories, very coded stories that the audience is going to pick up on. Oh, this isn't about the Hebrew slaves. This is about the Austrians occupying the Italian peninsula, sort of thing. If the composer had said the political sentiments that they put in their opera, if they had just come out and spoken that, some of them would have been arrested for treason. But they're able to put it in music, in a beautiful story, and everybody in the audience is going, yeah, we get it. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely gorgeous music. Sir Walter Scott, as I had mentioned before, a British author who brings out all these wonderful tales and kind of recreates the whole medieval knights and ladies and damsels in distress. Adam Minkiewicz is also going to write important literature about Polish characters that help to unite the Poles. So these ideas of nationalism get expressed not just in books, but in all sorts of art forms. And of course, the opposite of nationalism, Orientalism. This is a really old-fashioned word, but it reflects that romantic feeling of the East as opposed to Europe, which they say is the West. And people are fascinated by foreign things as well. It's a romantic way of seeing this other culture. You might not understand it, but you can feel it. That's pure romanticism. So one of the aspects they're looking at is, of course, the Muslim influence in places like Spain, Granada, and Cordoba, and North Africa. And they're interested in it, but ironically, at the exact same time that they're saying, oh, the Ottoman Empire is a terrible empire. But it's fascinating, so we want to look at it. They're also looking for the roots of Christianity. There's a reborn interest in the early church fathers. You see a lot of paintings of the ancient Roman Empire, and a fascination, of course, with medieval history and the Crusades, which of course is the Christian knights against the Saracens, against the Muslim fighters. So here again, more of this Europe for Christians versus the East for Islam. And music and plays. And as I said, there were plays that started riots. There were operas that started riots because everything became very political. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe is a German writer who is going to write some of the really important seminal works. He was a good friend of Ludwig van Beethoven. Both men are very early in this classical period that goes into the Romantic period. In fact, if you listen closely to Beethoven's symphonies, his first symphony sounds nothing like his ninth symphony. His first three symphonies were written in a very classical style. But his later symphonies, his fifth, his sixth was pastoral, his seventh, and especially his ninth. These you can see the development of his thinking into a more romantic ideal. And so these two men were very transitional figures, going from a very strict classical period to a very opened up romantic period. And they were interesting people. There is a story of Goethe and Beethoven going for a walk, that they knew each other and they were very good friends. And both of them had reached some renown by this time. And they're going for a walk in the city, and a group of men go by, and one of the members of this group of men is a cardinal, a bishop. And Goethe, of course, just reflexively takes off his hat, bows deeply, as a salute to this bishop, because he's a very powerful man. And Beethoven pays him no mind, just keeps on walking, doesn't even look at him. And Goethe is mortified. He runs up, catches up with Beethoven and says, that was a cardinal. Why didn't you bow? Why didn't you show your respect for him? And Beethoven said, there will be thousands of cardinals. There will be one Beethoven. So that cult of the individual is there, very much in Beethoven. And so we have reached the end of this chapter. I wanted to go into another chapter tonight. Ain't happening. Do you have any questions for me?
So we keep going?
Pardon me? No, I'm not going to keep going. This is enough. I've made you sit through way too much.
So can I sit with you after class ends?
Yes. I will hang out. I will stop my recording here. And